Of you joining us via streaming to Congregational Door to Door Community Program Series. I'm Brian Land, President of Congregational Door to Door. For those of you joining us virtually and not familiar with our temple, Congregational Door to Door is a Reformed synagogue located here in Oyster Bay. We are presenting this community program series so we can be more than just a religious institution in Oyster Bay. We hope to be a beacon of light and education to our entire community, not just the Jewish community. Tonight, we are pleased to present to you, in conjunction with Cornell University and the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs, the first program in a series of 3 entitled, Is Bipartisanship Possible?, featuring United States Congressman Steve Israel and former United States Congressman Peter King. Our discussion tonight will be moderated by our own Rabbi Steven Moskowitz. Before we begin the discussion, let me say a few words about each of our guests and our moderator. But before I do that, I just want to acknowledge Steve Stern, New York State Assemblyman, who's joining us tonight, and Nassau County Executive Blakeman, who came and paid us a visit as well. So thank you both. Steve Israel left Capitol Hill unindicted and undefeated to pursue a career as a writer. In addition to writing 2 critically acclaimed satires of Washington, he heads the nonpartisan Cornell Institute of Politics and Global Affairs in New York City. Steve was a member of Congress for 16 years and represented the 2nd and 3rd Congressional districts of Long Island. He left in 2017, having served as House Democratic Chief Political Strategist between 2011 and 2015 and chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. President Bill Clinton called him one of the most thoughtful members of Congress, which Israel states isn't really saying much at all. Israel is a regular political commentator on MSNBC. His insights appear regularly in the New York Times, the Atlantic magazine, as well as the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal. He was profiled on HBO's Last Week Tonight with John Oliver and appeared on 60 Minutes. Israel is currently the director of the new nonpartisan Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University, the only academically based institute of politics in the New York City metropolitan area. Its mission is to raise the discourse of deeper understanding of political issues and geopolitics. Finally, I am pleased to announce that Steve is a resident of Oyster Bay Cove and has recently given birth to a new baby named Theodore. Theodore's books. It's the culmination of a lifelong dream of Steve's to own a bookstore, and he opened the store this past weekend. It's an amazing place that I urge you all to visit. He's also offered all of us a 5% discount, so definitely go.
Premium, actually.
Our second guest tonight is former United States Congressman Peter King. Congressman King has had a long and distinguished career, having served in the U.S. Congress for 28 years, representing also Long Island's 2nd and 3rd Congressional districts. He held many important positions in Congress, culminating in being named chair of the important House Committee on Homeland Security. Prior to serving in Congress, he served in numerous positions in the Nassau County government. Much has been said about Congressman King and his long and illustrious career, but I think if one were to ask the congressman what he might be most proud of during his time in Washington, D.C., it was that he was named repeatedly the most bipartisan member of Congress by his peers, a stamp of independence that he rightfully wears as a badge of honor. Congressman King continues to offer his thoughts and opinions on today's current events and can be heard regularly on the radio and television. He continues to reside here on Long Island with his wife and family. Finally, our moderator for tonight is Rabbi Steven Moskowitz, our spiritual leader. Rabbi Moskowitz has served as rabbi for 22 years. Prior to his current position, he served as assistant director of 92nd Street Y's Brahman Center for Jewish Life, where he directed the center's renowned outreach programs. Under his leadership, the Introduction to Judaism class, Derek Torah, gained national recognition, educating nearly 200 Jews and non-Jews per year in New York and countless more in 15 satellite cities through the United States. Our pulpit offers him the unique opportunity to fashion a synagogue community in which singing and learning, compassion and joy are its hallmarks. All are made to feel welcome at a congregation and to these events. Before commencing tonight's discussion, just a few quick announcements about upcoming events in our community program series. Next Wednesday, we'll have our 3rd event in our economic series entitled Airlines in the Pandemic, featuring Andrew Sandler in discussion with Robert Land, co-founder of JetBlue Airways. Then Congressman Israel will join us again on February 2nd to bring us a conversation with renowned columnist Bret Stephens. We hope you all can join us for these events and many of the others coming up. All of you are welcome. Now, without further ado, please give a big hand and welcome to Congressman Steve Israel, Congressman Peter King, and Rabbi Moskowitz. Enjoy the discussion, and please save your questions till the end.
So the theme for our evening discussion is bipartisanship possible? And I thought we would begin really with the two of you and your friendship and your relationship and how that started. Steve, you came to Congress, and you had already been in Congress, Peter, for
8 years.
8 years. So how did your relationship begin? Steve, can you tell us? Did Peter reach out to you? And
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for bringing us together. I do also want to acknowledge Nassau County Legislator Josh Laffizin, who just came in. Legislator, thank you for being with us, and Assemblyman Stern, always wonderful to see you. So Peter and I actually go back before Congress. I grew up in Wantagh, and Peter was in Seaford. We were both zone leaders. Peter was a Republican zone leader, and I was a Democratic zone leader. I was a zone leader for the Nassau.
We call ourselves executive committeemen.
Oh, executive committee man. The Republicans are always so good at messaging, right? I'm zone leader, executive committee man. So
we Joe Maggiato and Al D'Amato. We knew what we were told.
Right. So we knew each other. I have a very vivid memory. And when I was elected, I don't know if you remember this, but I sent you a picture that appeared in the Levittown Tribune. It was election day, 1976. We were both at the same poll. You were the controller at the time, right? In 76?
I would have been running for councilman, probably.
Oh, councilman. You came in and you said, and I quote, "Let's cut the BS. Tell me who you think is going to win." And I laughed. Of course, Peter, back in 1976, what were you, like 60, 65 years old back then, and I was 12. And somebody snapped a picture of this, and it appeared in the local newspaper, and I saved it.
So did the FBI, by the way.
So we had known each other, but when I was elected in 2000, I met with Peter. And one of the things he told me was, and it was a very important lesson, was there are going to be times for politics, and there are going to be times for us to just get together and figure stuff out for our districts. I think we spent a lot of time jousting, no question about it, but behind the scenes, the vast majority of our time was spent trying to figure out what we could agree on and how you bring people together based on that.
Yeah, I would basically agree with everything Steve said. I'm still trying to get the negatives of that picture that was taken back in 76. And I was only about 82 then. I wasn't by the way, I have 8 years of seniority on him. He makes it sound like I'm 110 years old. No, actually, I would sum up as far as what bipartisanship means to me, which really, to me, is exemplified by the relationship I've had with Steve, is that you don't expect people to agree with you. Bipartisanship doesn't mean you do what the other person wants you to do, per se. We have principles, we stand by them. But what it means is, to me, first of all, you should never be unnecessarily partisan. On issues where you can agree, even come close to agreeing, to me, you have an obligation to sit down and try to work it out. That's especially true when it came to New York. Issues like 9/11 healthcare, Sandy relief. I mean, those are issues that, to me, it's a sin, if I can use that word, an abomination to be working against each other on something which is the best interest of our state. I would say I can't think of any issue involving New York State, New York City, even for that matter, or Long Island, where we disagreed. We always found a way to make it work. And we didn't try to play off the suburbs against the city. We didn't try to play off one district against another. In other states, that's very common. Like in California, I don't think any Republicans ever spoke to a Democrat out there. I mean, it's actually armed camps.
Can you say a little bit more? So was the issue, was what brought you together that you shared this place, the same home in a sense, and that's what pushed you together?
Yeah, I actually spent some time with Steve in the 90s when he was a councilman in the town of Huntington. And I remember occasionally he'd be in Washington. We'd go back and forth in the plane, and he would tell me how I was lucky enough to win my election in 1992. He told me some of the mistakes my opponent had made. And if Steve ever ran for Congress, he wouldn't make those mistakes. No, we knew each other. And I think if you're from the same area, both of us are sport fans, baseball fans, and we...
Do you support the same teams?
Seaford and Wantor. I mean, Seaford's a little bit more upscale than Wantor, but for the most part, they're the same.
Have you been to Seaford?
So, even the newspapers, the Wantor Seaford Citizen or the Seaford Wantor Observer, depending on who should be first. No, and we had a lot in common. And also, I think we both had a real love of politics. We understood what it was all about. Yeah. We didn't think that because the other person was opposed to you on some views, that person is evil or should be demonized. And in sort of, I mean, Steve could admire a very conservative Republican for how he ran his campaign or how he articulates his issue. I still vote against him, but I mean, you can appreciate it. And we used to have more of those in Congress than we do today. Yeah.
So is the commonalities that you found, why did you seize on those first? You know, how did that cement the relationship? Because it doesn't, at least my, outside observer is that we seem to be looking at the differences first as opposed to the commonalities. Both of you have articulated this idea that first we're going to look at what we share and what we agree on and start there.
So, well, first of all, you have to understand there's 435 members of Congress. It's hard to know 435 colleagues.
And so, don't want to know.
Most of them, you walk in the opposite direction. But so there's just that familiarity, somebody that you know, somebody that you're comfortable with, somebody you see on the plane, somebody you've read about in Newsday, somebody that is a neighbor. So there was that kind of organic collegiality. But then there were issues that really brought us together. And so the first issue that really brought us together was 9/11. I'd been a congressman for all of 9 months. And suddenly I found myself in meetings with the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense and the Intel Director. My biggest meeting until then was meeting with the Highway Superintendent of Huntington. And now I'm thrust into this environment. And, I was new to the job. I watched Peter. He was in the same meetings. And I respected the points that he was making to the President of the United States, the Vice President, Secretary of Defense. And we both went through this common tragedy. We weren't personally affected. Well, I don't think you were personally affected, but 200 funerals in my district. 200 funerals. How many in yours?
Oh, we had, I think our district's almost the same as far as the number who were killed. And if you combine the district we had both times, it was well over 200 people. Yeah, easily, 200-300.
And so, and we were at ground zero together on the Friday after the attack with President Bush. And people, they bond in crisis.
Yes.
They bond in crisis, and so I really, we just found ways of talking about what needed to be done, and just had no tolerance for the politics of it. It was just about how do we get through this? What do we do to support our constituents and keep our country safe? And that was a very important binding experience that served us well with Hurricane Sandy and the economic meltdown in 2008 and many other things.
Peter, can you reflect, though, a little bit? We're in a crisis right now. I mean, we're still in a pandemic, and yet we don't seem to be, we seem again to be screaming at each other rather than this shared bond that you guys are talking about.
Well, if I can go back to 9/11 and that, also I remember Steve and I, a lot of this is forgotten now, but a real issue then was how do you compensate the families of those who were killed? And depending on what kind of a formula you come up with, you can have a fireman's widow getting $10 and a millionaire from Wall Street getting $10 million. I mean, you had to find a way where it was a fair compensation. And so we had a large meeting, but we had hundreds of family members that were there, and we had Feinberg.
Ken Feinberg, yeah.
Ken Feinberg, who's a very nice guy. But he was in the middle of all this. We had all these families coming at him. They were angry and they were sad. There was really a. So we had what was that? Hundreds of people in the room that night.
That was at the Hilton,
yeah,
I think in
so,
Huntington. Yeah.
And so we had events, if you want to call it like that, and then also we had to form together as New Yorkers, because as tragic as 9/11 was, and as tragic, as unified as the country seemed. As each month went by, other parts of the country started to look upon this as a New York issue.
Right.
And they'd want to give us the funding we needed for Homeland Security, for the families, for healthcare. That went on really for 15 years, one way or the other. But we sort of bonded together on that. And also, if I could just say, coming from New York, other parts of the country, if you come from a district in certain states, everyone there looks and sounds like you. The same bloodlines, the same, and it could be like all black districts, all WASP districts, all, especially when you get in parts of the South where the district is either all white or all black for the most part. And they've really never dealt. Now in New York, likely that you have to deal with everybody. We have every ethnic group, every race, every religion. And especially here on Long Island, we have, like I remember on election night in Nassau County, going back to the days of Joe Margiata, you walk into the room, we had labor leaders in there, business leaders, we had blacks, we had rabbis, we had ministers, priests, everybody was in there. And so you're forced to work together. And I think, so we had more of a realization that we didn't necessarily have all the answers. And there was no, well, you get a guy from some districts, they've never heard a competing argument. They are convinced they're 110% right.
Interesting.
Here in New York, you walk into a room, well, walk into a temple, and you go to a meeting, and you get 100 different
Everyone agrees with my sermons, by the way, all the time.
So, I have to say, among the liveliest moments I had was when you have those Sunday morning debates in the temples. It was, I mean, no matter what you said, you were going to get somebody standing up. And then the beauty was, then if you did it right, you get them fighting with each other, and I could sort of step back. So, no, but seriously, oh, you're saying today with COVID?
It is a crisis.
It's a real crisis, yeah. And it's how do you handle it? I think in some ways it was easier with 9/11, certainly in the first few years. You know, it was Al-Qaeda we had to build up a Homeland Security system. We had to make sure that our police and fire had the resources they needed. With COVID, you don't see it. And then you have so much, also there's no social media. As a practical matter, there's no social media back in 2001.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Now it's you can go online and the vaccines are either conspiracy to kill us all or there's not enough vaccine, it's being intentionally held back because they want people to die. You can go through all of these crazy theories. And so that's, I think COVID is probably the most extreme example of that. But in almost every issue, if you go online, you can find out how a particular, like for instance, my successor in Congress, Andrew Garbarino, I'm not making a campaign pitch, but he voted for the infrastructure bill, which probably, if you just laid out the issues, 80% of the district would say, yes, vote for this, vote for this, vote for this. But because this suddenly became Joe Biden's bill, any Republican who voted for it was looked upon as a traitor. Meanwhile, that had passed this summer in the Senate with 69 votes. Nobody said a word about it. But now, because it was dragging into, and then they in their mind, they identified it with the reconciliation bill. So social media has been a big factor, I think.
You believe that social media has been the largest problem in terms of this?
As far as COVID, but if you're talking about the lack of bipartisanship, I would say the initial problem is redistricting, cable television, and then social media was like the icing on the cake that really set it off. Like, even if it's a bad, let's say Democrats get wiped out or Republicans get wiped out in an election, still 90% of us, or 80% at the very least, are going to be reelected. So what you have to worry about is not so much winning in November, because odds are, unless it's a really bad year, you're going to get reelected in November. It's winning your primary. And don't quote me on this, because I can say it, I'm not in politics anymore, but maybe 10% of each party is crazy. I mean, they are so fanatical and obsessed. And the other rule of thumb is that only about 15 to 20% of people come out to vote in primaries.
Right.
So the people who have extreme views have a disproportionate influence. I'll end on this and then turn it over to Steve, obviously. Eric Cantor was probably the most conservative majority leader ever in the history of the House. He lost by 12 points in a primary to an unknown conservative. They found some amendment on some obscure immigration bill that they said was going to open the borders to the entire world. And based on that, which I don't even know if Eric knew he even voted, it was obscure. It was a misinterpretation of an obscure amendment. They got enough money to zero in on that. And you had people like Laura Ingraham and others on Fox. And Eric, who could have been easily Speaker of the House, he got killed in the primary. So that was a lesson to all of us. And then we saw Joe Crowley on the Democratic side a few years later.
Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so we've been studying this at the Cornell Institute of Politics. We don't have to study it. Peter and I lived through it. Let me quantify how bad it is and then talk about the contributing factor. Peter mentioned gerrymandering, congressional redistricting, where politicians in state capitals draw districts to protect their party, to protect members of Congress in their party, and not to make sure that districts conform to the constitutional requirement that all members of Congress represent roughly the same number of people. As a result of gerrymandering, as a result of what's called residential sorting patterns, which we could get into, as a result of social media, as a result of the tribalization of cable television, this is what has happened. When I was elected in 2000, out of 435 congressional districts, about 150 were considered moderate swing districts. Could go either to the left or to the right, purple. In 2011, I chaired the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. My job was, very bluntly, to beat Republicans and elect Democrats across the country. My battlefield in 2011 was 75 districts. So from 2001 to 2011, the number of competitive districts where both parties could play had been cut in half. In 2016, when I left, the number of competitive districts was about 30. In 2000, right now, the number of pure competitive districts, purely swing districts, is 16. 150 to 16. The 16, by the way, are 9 districts which a Democratic House member won and Trump won, and 7 districts which a Republican, I'm sorry, I got it backwards. 9 districts which a Republican House member won and Biden won, and 7 districts which a Democratic House member won and Trump won. Now you could argue, well, it's not really 16, it's more like 20 or 25. On a good day, there are 25 competitive purple moderate districts. Because, to Peter's point, when you draw a safe district for a Democrat, that Democratic member of Congress does not wake up in the morning fearing a loss to a Republican, because there's no way a Republican can compete. Wakes up in the morning fearing a loss to somebody further to the left. And when you draw a safe district for a Republican, that Republican doesn't wake up in the morning fearing a Democratic opponent, but fearing somebody further to the right. So what has happened is members of Congress have gone further to the flanks to protect their flanks. Gerrymandering is one big problem. The second problem is residential sorting patterns. So there's Dave Wasserman from Cook Political Report. He did an amazing study. He studied how we are making our own choices to live with people with whom we agree. And this is what he learned. If you live within 100 miles of a Cracker Barrel restaurant, your member of Congress is likely to be a Republican. If you live within 100 miles of a Whole Foods, your member of Congress is likely to be a Democrat. And if you live within 100 miles of both, it's a swing district. So we are making decisions to live with people with whom we agree. And then finally, you add social media and the tribalization. Peter is on ABC radio. I listen to him. Peter probably spent a lot of time on Fox News. I spent a lot of time on MSNBC. I knew when I was on MSNBC that I wasn't speaking to a Fox News demographic, and I'm sure you knew when you were on Fox you weren't speaking to an MSNBC demographic. So we tend to, now we're living in echo chambers of echo chambers of echo chambers. And that explains why most members of Congress really, maybe I shouldn't say most, but a significant number, they don't have this. Peter and I have this because we live in moderate communities, right? It's diverse. But if you're living in a Fox News Cracker Barrel district, right, and suddenly you see a Democrat who says, well, I think we ought to expand Medicare, you're like, well, that Democrat is from another planet. That Democrat doesn't understand what's happening in the world. I know what's happening in the world because I listen to my constituents. And it's the same thing for Democrats who see a Republican who says, well, we need some entitlement reform, right, or we need to reduce debt. The Democrat will look at somebody like Peter King and say, this guy's nuts. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Because those constituents, those members of Congress, are only hearing one side of the story all day long.
When Steve, to interrupt for a second, when he talks about redistricting, it might sound like an abstraction. it is so sophisticated. You can walk into a room and tell a guy, I want a district with 43% single women or women over the age of 55 or men under the age of 38 and whatever. So many Republicans, so many Democrats, so many people leaning this way. And within minutes, they have it drawn up for you. Now compare that. Charlie Rangel told me, not dating myself, he cast a vote for Nelson Rockefeller back in Congress, 1971, which was really important. And he went against his party somewhat in doing it. Rockefeller owed him. Rockefeller guaranteed him a safe district when they did reapportionment in 1972. Charlie says they were on their hands and knees in the executive chamber with magic markers and a Hagstrom's map trying to draw lines as to how they could give him a safe district. Imagine Nelson Rockefeller on his hands and knees drawing a district with Charlie Rangel. Today, you'd have some 23-year-old computer genius who, like that, would give you exactly what you wanted, an unbeatable district. And also, when Steve says you put Democrats into a district to make it more Democratic, that means you're taking them out of a Republican district.
Right.
So it makes the Republican district that much stronger.
And I hear both of you saying, and I want to just reflect back, it seems so important that the good fear, if you will, is the fear that you might lose to someone on the other side of the aisle as opposed to your left or right flank. I mean, that's what keeps us sort of closer to the center. And we've created these districts where we're leaning just only to the most extreme, especially what you said in terms of the importance of primaries.
Yeah, the primaries are the key. And again, I'm not to make this partisan. We had Eric Cantor. Joe Crowley was supposed to be the next Speaker of the House for the Democrats. And he lost to someone who nobody ever heard of before. So
is this fixable?
Well, it's fixable. It's hard to fix, but it is fixable. It's fixable if we had some fundamental redistricting reforms. Now, the good news is many states are doing it on their own. Many states have said Congress is never going to fix this. Congress is never going to produce incumbents who will counter human nature, which is to say, let's fix the problem even if I may lose.
If I lose, yeah.
That's contrary to human nature. So many states by themselves, something like 30 states, have created independent redistricting commissions. Some are not really independent. Some are window dressing. But in Arizona, for example, Arizona has a truly independent redistricting commission. Other states have redistricting independent commissions. Courts, there are legal standards. Florida has something called fair standards. I'm not sure the exact name, but you have to, in Florida, you have to show that the district was drawn not for political purposes, but to reflect populations. So those states are adopting those reforms on their own. But we're going to have to go further than that. I mean, one of the things we're going to have to do is just start listening to one another again. And just a final point on this, one of the great experiences that I had in Congress was I formed something called the Center Aisle Caucus, which is 25 Democrats and 25 Republicans. We'd meet at the Hunan Dynasty Chinese restaurant because Chinese food is cheap, and it was 3 blocks away from the Capitol, so we could go and vote. And this is what we learned. We pick an issue like Obamacare, have a kitchen timer, set it 5 minutes, yell at one another about your disagreements. 55 minutes, what can you agree on? And this is what we learned. Peter King and I are going to disagree probably on 70% of issues. There's a reason Peter's a Republican, there's a reason I'm a Democrat. The problem with Washington is it spends 100% of its time beating each other up over 70% where there will never be agreement, instead of spending time on the 30% where you can get agreement. When we learn how to work together on the 30%, as Peter and I have done, and others, the country will be 100% better off.
Agreed. Do you agree with the
I do,
analysis?
Yeah. Also, when the party leaders set up the agenda, they try to pick out the hot-button topics, which are going to put the other party, the minority party,
on their heels,
in a tough spot. Yeah, make them cast the tough votes. And like in the House Rules Committee decides what amendments are going to be allowed. So if you're in the majority party, basically you're not going to let the opposition introduce amendments that are going to embarrass them. So when the Republicans were in charge, we gave these guys very few amendments. The Democrats were in charge, they gave us very few. Because they knew that we would, unfortunately, not necessarily have good amendments, but amendments to make them cast votes. Or let's say we knew there were 10 very vulnerable Democratic seats. We would pick an amendment which affected nobody except those 10 seats.
Yeah.
to put them in a position of having to vote yes or either for or against it. So that too much time is spent. Listen, politics is politics. It's a tough business. There should be a time and place for everything, and it's when it comes to, it's become almost incessant. The day you're elected, you're doing fundraising for your next race, and I don't miss that. I gotta say.
Okay.
Sir, since we're reflecting on your friendship and bipartisanship, was there ever a time that's, I'd like to ask you, Peter, where Steve influenced your vote and vice versa?
I would say we probably, it was more like a bargaining. I mean, can you do this, can you do that? For instance, as far as funding issues or as far as, and usually it was, we knew issues that were just party reasons, whatever, we'd be on the opposite sides of, which didn't even matter that much. I mean, but on key issues, certainly affecting New York, we would not so much be influencing each other, but we would ask each other, who can we talk to in our party? Yeah. Like, can we get a guy from Arkansas or Mississippi who really doesn't care about New York, but we get him to vote for this? In doing that, we got to promise to give him something on a vote that's good for him. So, yeah, we would do that. He would say, talk to this guy, or can we talk to that guy? And that happened during Sandy. Also, 9/11 healthcare, it was, Kevin, you got some surprising votes. Like, for instance, Tom Cotton, a very conservative senator from Arkansas, he was in the House. He was one of the first guys to come out, I guess, in 2015 when we were trying to extend 9/11 healthcare. And to be honest with you, I helped him out in one of his first races in Arkansas, so I was able to go to him now and say, Tom, we need some help here. And but again, we would do that, or we would make it a point of not say something negative about a guy on the Democratic side. This guy's going to be with us in this bill. Don't be attacking him.
Yeah, but we also had a tacit agreement that not many of our colleagues would have, which was we never campaigned against one another. I mean, that gets really dicey when you're in the same media market and you're supposed to be doing stuff together, and then you go out of your way to defeat the person that you need to work with. So we always had an agreement. And the agreement was, look, I'm going to have to endorse this person. I get it, Peter gets it. I got it when he had to endorse my opponents, but it stopped at an endorsement. We had an agreement. We weren't going out of our way. We weren't raising a ton of money for each other's opponents. We weren't making it our life's mission to support the other members' opponents.
How unusual is that?
That is, I think it's very unusual, and I'll tell you. So I was the chairman of the DCCC. I don't want to pat my back too much, but I took some pretty tough shots from my own party because when I was the chairman of the DCCC, they believed that Peter's district was winnable. I didn't believe it was winnable, but it didn't matter what I believed. My job was, to try and beat him, and I just said, look, I'm just not going to do it. Just not going to do it. It would wreck our relationship. It would be hurtful to our constituents. And by the way, you may find this hard to believe, but you know what the precedent was? Rahm Emanuel and Ray LaHood. When Rahm Emanuel was the chairman of the DCCC, he refused to go after Republican Congressman Ray LaHood because who became Secretary of Transportation because they
under Obama.
Under Obama, because he knew if he went after Ray LaHood, then there was no chance of getting Ray LaHood's help if there were a Republican administration with the needs of Illinois. So
how did this tacit agreement come about?
Some was body language. I mean,
yeah.
It was just the right thing to do. I mean, it would have been unusual if I woke up in the morning and saw a Newsday, see Israel telling people how stupid I really am. I mean, if I ever saw that.
Fake news. That's fake news.
No, it was just something we. Also, just the fact that we knew each other and spoke to each other. Guys from other states, they could be in adjoining districts and never even look at each other.
Yeah.
Also, our districts are smaller, and some of our communities are interlocked. You have a hill of the northern half, and I have the southern half, a hill of the eastern half, and I have the western half of the same community. While some of these guys are in districts that's 600 miles. Some guys need helicopters to get around their district. So they have no real contact with each other, and or they end up on some right-wing show or left-wing show and taking long-distance shots. Even though they're in adjoining districts, it's still really almost a long-distance shot. So it's a different mentality. I mean, New York is different. I mean, it's good and it's bad. The good part of it is that we've learned how to deal with each other, even labor management. I mean, you go to most Republican organizations here, certainly downstate, and they work very closely with labor. Now, labor may support Democrats more than Republicans, not always, but they're part of, we deal with them. I had guys on Republicans who never met with a labor guy. They wouldn't know what a labor leader was. They figure he's a criminal or he's a gangster or he's out to get them. No contact whatsoever. And Democrats here deal with business, which they may not do in other states.
I think it's fascinating, both of you articulating the idea that friendship is so crucial and your relationship is so crucial in terms of getting things done in the bipartisanship. And also, I just wanted to highlight something else that you both said, which is listening to differences. I mean, you know, intentionally reading things that you disagree with and hearing opinions that you vehemently disagree with is enormously important. You know, how we get out of those echo chambers that we're in is enormously, I think, difficult.
The echo chamber is really the right word, because we have, I mean, I've spoken to people in my party, I'm sure Steve had, who have never heard a contrary view. They wouldn't even listen to it, acknowledge it, or know it exists.
Well, we were speaking before and earlier that I think the commitment to ideology and philosophy is now what's first and foremost. You know, that I have to be loyal to my ideology, which might work in a parliamentary democracy like Israel, where every philosophy and ideology is representative, but it seems to break down when there's only two parties. And because the system is built on, you have to work together. You have to be committed to the other side for at least those 2 years.
I think the reality is we probably couldn't exist as a country if we had so many parties. On the other hand, we have to force ourselves to live in the two parties, because right now, you're right. I mean, the bases of both parties are controlling what's happening. You know, even the bills that are brought to the floor. You may have Democrats who strongly support a particular issue, but it can end up putting too many other Democrats in the vulnerable spots. The leader won't bring it up. Same in our party. It's a different world. Also, there's the regional bias. One thing that does unite a good part of Congress is they hate New York. And that's, I should say, Republicans dislike New York for other parts of the country, and Democrats don't care. They take it for granted. They figure New York's going to vote Democrat anyway. Who cares? Republicans say, you know, they're never going to vote Republican. Why should we help them? But that's okay if we have some obscure issues. When you're talking about 9/11 healthcare, when people were dying, we had Republicans on the House floor denying that people were dying from 9/11 illnesses. In fact, we had Zadroga. He was NYPD. He was supposedly the first person to die from 9/11 illness. So the bill was named after him. His father's in the gallery during the debate. We had a guy in our party pointing out, saying it was a phony, that this guy wasn't sick at all, or I think he was trying to say he was a drug addict or whatever, which is all untrue. So, I mean, that's the type of attitude that you have.
I would suggest it's also unfeeling to do that to someone who's mourning a loss.
But also saying that other part, as far as Democrats take this for granted, like President Obama never weighed in on that issue. There's no bill signing ceremony, because, again, they take it for granted that New Yorkers are always now. I'm just saying that uncaring, but there was very little shown by, I'll give Nancy Pelosi credit. She was very good on this. But as far as the White House, we got very little support on 9/11 health care. They weren't against it, but they didn't, you know, the White House can get things done if they really want to.
So we're in a synagogue, obviously, so let's talk a little bit about issues that affect the Jewish community and if there are any differences.
Steve told me everything affected the Jewish community.
I would tell Peter, you must support Israel at all times.
Did he need any convincing?
Never question Israel.
Save Israel, a country, whatever it is.
So, I mean, anti-Semitism is on the rise.
Yeah.
We're seeing it, and we're very concerned about it, obviously, in the Jewish community. I would like to think that others are as well. And I'm just wondering if you could weigh in on your thoughts or your concerns about that.
No, it's really there, and it's taken on almost a life of its own in the last several years. And again, I'm not trying to make this partisan at all. A lot of it comes from elements of the African American community. Unfortunately, there's been anti-Semitism there. You've always had it in parts of the rural South among Republicans, and it's almost becoming tolerated now. Yeah. I mean, we had, again, when I bring it up, we had some very anti-Semitic remarks made a few years ago. Nancy Pelosi, when we arrived back in Congress on Monday afternoon or Tuesday afternoon, on our desks was this was after you had left, actually legislation being very critical of a certain congresswoman for things she had said. It was clearly directed at her. There was such a pushback on the Democratic side from certain elements. By the time we voted on it, every conceivable ethnic group and religion was mentioned in there, as we have to protect them. And so the woman who was aimed at ended up voting for it, because it was so watered down. And so anti-Semitism is, especially the code words, are becoming more acceptable. Still, with all of the talk about Islamophobia and everything else during the George Floyd riots, I would say every year still the most vandalism is committed against temples and Jewish houses of worship. I mean, more than it still, I think it's always been consistent. Even after 9/11, there was no comparison between Muslim vandalism or attacks, then it's always been, for whatever reason, but it seems to be getting worse and it's more acceptable, like a place like Columbia University or many universities, unfortunately, among the elite, it's tolerated. And often criticisms of Israel or Israeli policies are really, to me, and I'm not Jewish, so maybe I'm not as sensitive, but if I'm sensitive to it, I can imagine that it's there. There's real anti-Semitic tones to a lot of the criticisms of Israel, which go beyond one ally criticizing another, or honest criticism. There's a real anti-Semitic tone to a lot of it.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, so look, I've always avoided attributing anti-Semitism to one political party or the other. And I don't care who expresses anti-Semitism. No justification, no rationale, no excuse. The fact is that anti-Semitic incidents are at their highest level in history, and those trends began going up in 2016. Now, you can argue that it's a function of the economy, it's a function of desperation, it's a function of lots of different socioeconomic convergences. I'm not an expert on it. But there is a sense that there's always been anti-Semitism in this country, always. But there's a sense now, I fear, that it's okay to march in Rockville Center as the Proud Boys. By the way, I don't know what's so proud about being a Proud Boy when you have to put a mask over your face because you don't want to be identified. That doesn't exactly smack of pride to me. We're the Proud Boys, but we hope nobody notices who we are. But it seems okay. It seems okay to go to the capital of Michigan and stand with swastikas, posters, while you're trying to disrupt the government of Michigan. It's okay to wear a T-shirt that says Camp Auschwitz when you are part of not an insurrection in the Capitol, in my view, but domestic terrorists trying to stop the certification of a democratic election and kill members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. It's okay to wear a Camp Auschwitz T-shirt. So anti-Semitism has always been part of America. But what really concerns me is that the anti-Semites now feel a sense of license. And that's bad for everybody, I think.
I do think we have to address it in the universities where it's becoming more tolerated. Acceptable comment. Listen, you can always criticize Israel, you can criticize any country in the world, but it should be done in a constructive, diplomatic, political way, not with an overtone, well, that's the way they are, or you can't trust them, that type.
Yeah, I think what many people have expressed to me, what many people feel is a bit of a sense of abandonment, that where are our allies speaking up for and defending, the Jewish community, both, from the anti-Semitism on the left and the right. We don't feel it. I would just say to your comment, Peter, in terms of the anti-Semitism on the left, it is much more easier to identify an anti-Semite when they're holding a Nazi flag. It's much harder when it's in academia. It's much clearer, it's a much more black and white distinction. Before we open up for questions, I just want to ask you both to respond to, I hear from a lot of young people, those in their 20s and 30s, that a sense of disillusionment in the political system. Both of you have dedicated an enormous amount of time and your life in the political system. People are 20-something say, I'm not going to vote, it doesn't matter. I don't want to get involved. It's all rigged. I mean, these are some of the things that I hear. It's certainly not what I believe, but I'd like you to, how do you respond to that young person who says that?
Yeah, I try to be affirmative on that, saying that in a democracy, or a republic, whatever you want to call ourselves, constitutional republic, democracy, that you have an obligation to be involved. I mean, it's not a spectator sport. I mean, you should be actively involved. And Steve and I have traveled to so many countries around the world where people will give their right arm to be able to vote,
right.
Just be able to speak out, and it can't be done. So I would say it's really, I would tell them if they feel a way to get involved, because in the end, people get the government they deserve. And so if enough people stay home, if enough people don't vote in primaries, that's why the extremes can take over. If every if a large percentage of registered Republicans or registered Democrats come out and vote in the party primaries, you'd have a better selection of candidates. But they stay home, and then that's politics when they get involved. Well, if you don't get involved, somebody else is going to get involved. They're going to fill that vacuum. So I would say get involved. And also, even just from a very practical point of view, it's very easy to get involved. I mean, if you're a local political leader, if you want to get involved with the party, they are looking for somebody with talent. If you have any kind of ability at all, if you're willing to work hard, you'll be brought in. If you want to come in at a different level, as somebody from a business level or labor level, you can do it. But I mean, there's really real opportunities to get engaged and to get involved. And otherwise, you can end up losing control of your country to whether it's big tech, big labor, big business, whatever, or just to ideological groups that on some particular day were able to get enough votes out.
I think the difficulty, though, is that it's a slog, you know, like it's hard work. You don't see results immediately. So we live in an age where you have immediate results. You know, you can watch whatever movie you want ever made, and right now. So this is a lot of work.
Big part of the problem is that we have developed a national attention deficit disorder.
Yes.
I think the worst invention ever created was the television clicker, because it like reprogrammed our brains. Like, if you don't like that, you go to that. If you don't like that, you go to that. And then add on social media, 147 or 143 characters in a tweet, and people have become accustomed to neat, easy answers that validate what they already believe. So there's a real lapse of critical thinking, I think, in America right now, a real deficiency of critical thinking. I have a slightly different view than you, Rabbi, about young people.
I'm reflecting back what I hear from
No,
people.
I understand. So my wife Kara is here, and she's heard me say this many times. The highlight of my week every week is from 11:15 to 1:15 on Thursdays, when I teach a course remotely at Cornell. And I've got about 20 students, and I glow after those 2 hours, because now maybe it's self-selecting. It's a bunch of Cornell students. But their view is, Congressman, you've screwed this up, right? Beyond
I
your,
agree with that.
That's right. Beyond your ability to repair it. So just move out of the way, and we will do it. We will do it. They are so enthusiastic. They feel such a sense of responsibility. They also understand that there are some unappetizing things that they're going to have to listen to in order to get it done. And they're willing to have those healthy engagements. So I'm inspired. Legislator Lapizan is here. See him nodding his head. How many interns do you have at any one time as a Nassau County legislator? 200 interns for a county legislator. That's engagement. And they're just not going to, I have a dystopic view of the next few years and the ability of this particular Congress on both sides of the aisle and the American people over the next few years to get us through this. But I have an eternally optimistic view of things.
Wonderful.
Once that next generation replenishes. They're just not going to tolerate the kind of screw-ups that they have seen over the past decade and a half or so.
Part of that could be.
The course I teach? The Life of Peter King. No, it's a course on politics, film, and popular culture. We trace the impact of popular culture on politics and politics on popular culture, starting from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Jimmy Stewart, 1939, and ending at the late night monologues on late night talk shows.
Yeah, I would say also, though, maybe it's generational, and maybe it's where we live in. Everything is a slogan now. It's a quick thing, end endless wars, or whatever. There's always, and yet, like my daughter Erin works with Steve at Cornell, and she said this seminar, this session you had on China and Asia and Taiwan yesterday, probably 95% of what was discussed there is unknown to the American people.
Yes.
Right.
Because basically you're told China was bad, China was good.
Yep.
Look out for this, don't get involved in this war with Taiwan, whatever. It's always an oversimplified thing, and yet how complicated it is. And yet, I mean, going back, I'm old enough to remember like the Nixon-Kennedy debates, where they actually discuss things in some detail. Today it's all buzzwords on both sides.
Yep.
They go at it. So if somehow younger people can be made to realize that it's not all good guys on one side and these issues are pretty complex. I found when people come to Congress, people come in who know all the answers, and they stay that way. Others come in, and they're willing, when they get, they go to the first committee hearing, and they realize, hey, there really are 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 sides to these issues. We got to put the best part of it together. So that's that. So I think these are, again, a lot of it is just changing the way people think and realize it's not all simplified. And it's tied in with the fact that the other guy's a bad guy. So therefore, there's no need to really discuss or explore what his stand is, because you know it's wrong. That type of thing.
If I may, so the thing that I know you want to go to questions, but what Peter's referring to is yesterday the Cornell Institute of Politics brought together 8 members of Congress from both sides of the aisle. We do a war game. And so we have a very sophisticated scenario. In this case, the Chinese had attacked our military satellites. And we had to deal.
But no one even knows this. And we're being attacked every day on a satellite.
Yeah, we're being attacked every day. And they have to game out. And it was, and Peter's daughter, Erin, former Hempstead Town Councilwoman, Republican, is the associate director of our institute. We had David Valadao, very conservative Republican member of Congress. Andrew Garbarino, new Republican. And it was amazing because it took 5 hours to get through this exercise. Point one is, if you really want to be able to work together, sometimes you just have to spend 5 hours understanding it, researching it. My favorite part was that moment in the exercise, Peter, where the liberal Democrats were saying, got to go to war. Can't allow China to do this. And the Republicans were saying, whoa, whoa. That could be a mistake. There's time, there's restraint. But think of the beauty of that, is we were able to break through those stereotypes, and they were all laughing. The Democrats and Republicans laughing about how the assumptions that they brought into that game were shattered because they had time to understand an issue and arrive at a logical solution to this. It was amazing.
The one part I heard about this session I didn't like is my daughter introduced Congressman Garbarino, and so I'm so glad that finally we have a congressman from the 2nd District with a brain. It's a great comment.
There was unanimous consent on that, by the way.
That brought everybody together. If I could just add one other thing, though, as far as getting involved in politics, people do expect quick results. And anyone who's been in the trenches, to me, I believe we need more of what we used to call the old type organization politics, where you got involved, going door to door, getting petitions signed, going to train stations, all the stuff that's considered grunt work, but it gives you a great realization and appreciation of how people think, what's on their minds. You can have an analyst come in and say, this is the issue that's going to win the election for you. If you knock on a few doors and say, what, are you crazy? What, are you nuts? You get a better idea what real people think about these issues. And today you have a lot of, let's face it, at least when I got elected, the first time I saw this, you had these millionaires going through a midlife crisis who decided they were going to run for Congress. It was just, and they bought themselves, we had a guy, Michael Huffington. This was a lot of money then. It's a lot of money now, but especially, he put $5 million of his own money into a seat. I don't know where he lived, in Texas or somewhere. He found a seat in California where he thought he could defeat him, move there, spend $5 million, and he got himself elected to Congress. And again, he was a guy, he was obviously in the middle of a midlife crisis, but he went and he got himself elected. And it was,
by the way, when we recruited candidates, we always looked for the guys with midlife crises and a lot of money. They would move anywhere.
That was something what I'm saying, though, right? Guys think, I've done this, I've done that, and I'm going to become a Congressman. Who never got a petition signed, never went to a club meeting, no idea what local people feel, but they either listen to Rush Limbaugh or Rachel Maddow or something, and they figure they know the whole story.
I like very much what you said in terms of listening to people and talking to constituents and hearing those ideas.
Well, we don't like. They can drive you crazy, but it gives you an idea
understand
what's out there.
Certainly. And we want to give time for people to ask questions. I'm going to ask if people have questions just to raise your hand. Brian here has a handheld microphone, and we're going to ask you to give your question into the microphone so those on the live stream can hear the question. And please ask questions rather than statements.
You said some, I just happened to hear Sid and Bernie, and you came on and said I was going to be speaking tonight in Oyster Bay. I wouldn't have known about this had you not been on Sid and Bernie.
Just to make the record clear, it was Sid, the Jewish guy, who made a point of saying I was going to be in the temple with Steve Israel tonight. So.
I'm sorry I was late, but this was really enjoyable. I was waiting for you to say, sir, could you wait for the questions at the end? Please don't interrupt. But I thought it was pertinent because the course is very interesting. You said some amazing things. First, Huffington has nothing to do with the Huffington Post, right? Michael Huffington was not a...
That was his wife, Ariana.
Oh, that was his wife, Ariana.
Ex-wife
Okay.
now, yeah. Ariana.
You made so many good points. The money in politics, and also that's the old expression, pressing the flesh, right? Getting out and talking to people at supermarkets and train stations.
Yeah, not just when you're campaigning. If you can get a few years in the trenches, being a local committeeman or a local club official, people are you're a political hack. Actually, that's how you learn about what it's all about. And to me, that's an education in itself.
Do you want to reflect also about the question about money?
Oh,
In
money
politics?
is definitely an issue, but it's, now I have a bit of a bias. I always ran against, not always, but often ran against people with a lot more money than I did. I'm not that supportive of campaign fund limits, mainly because there's no limits on what a newspaper can say about you. They can, and that can be worth millions of dollars in adverse publicity. There's no limit on them, and I, having had some bad dealings with Newsday over the years, I would never want them to think that I couldn't somehow match them if I tried.
I had read somewhere that you were outspent many elections that you ran.
Yeah, I was. In fact, we talked the first election, I was outspent 4-1. Steve and I discussed it. And this is the way it looked from my end afterwards when we did the analysis, that I knew I was going to be outspent 4-1. I was saving all my money for the last 2 weeks. My opponent, who had never really been in politics, he wasn't a bad guy either, but he took a poll about 3 weeks out, and he was told he couldn't lose. So he cut back. So as he was cutting back, I did put everything I could into not knowing that he was cutting back. So I had like an open field for the last 2 weeks. I ended up winning. It was 49. I still remember 49.6 to 46.6, and he was probably about 10 points up 2 weeks, 3 weeks out.
I
Okay,
do-
I have a lot of
wanna- I do
questions.
want to address, but I would like to address your point about money because we haven't talked about it, and it is a big reason for the dismal state of affairs in Congress right now. I left Congress significantly because I couldn't stand the fundraising regimen anymore. I couldn't stand to ask another donor for another dollar. Did a piece in the New York Times called "Confessions of a Congressman" the day after I announced that I wouldn't be seeking re-election, and I quantified how much time I had spent fundraising. From 2000 to 2016, I'd raised $20 million, and that's hard money. That's federal money. That's not corporate money. You're not allowed to give corporate contributions. It was a check at a time right out of people's personal bank accounts. $20 million. Had gone to something like 5,600 hours. 5,600 hours of my time on fundraising.
Trying to divide that.
And I ate 1,800 soggy egg rolls at the Tortilla Coast at PAC fundraisers. Here's the most insidious element of fundraising in politics. It helps explain why we're in a bubble. If I'm spending all my time talking to people who so adore my positions that they're willing to write a $5,000 check, I'm not exactly getting dissent on those calls, am I? And so you get into a donor bubble where people are agreeing with you so much so that they're willing to write a check. And if you're spending 10 hours, 15 hours, 20 hours a week talking to donors who agree with you, you're not getting dissenting opinions. It is not a good cross-section of opinion. And that has also contributed to this echo chamber, these two echo chambers on Capitol Hill.
I hope you guys have 5 hours. I have a lot of questions. No, just kidding. No.
Right.
Last question. What about Mark Zuckerberg putting $400 million in? And someone like Bloomberg, I thought, did a good job, didn't have to answer to anybody, was self-funding.
As far as self-funding, basically, it's impossible to stop that. I mean, the way Supreme Court decisions, and even it's looked upon as free speech, I guess. I'm running against a few millionaires, so I know what it's like. But again, I do have the concern about if there's no, and again, I was not a great fundraiser, but at least I figured it was in my arsenal if I had to do it. If you get a media who's really against you, I don't know how you match that, that's all. Whether it's Fox or MSNBC, whether it's the New York Post or the New York Times or whatever. I mean, I had a situation with Newsday once where they knew I was going to lose. And they came at me after my family, my son's out here, after him, my sister, my daughter, and everything else, and it was all BS. But again, fortunately, I had enough money to try to counter it. But if they come at you, they can print and print and print. And we have it mildly compared to some parts of the country where basically political parties own the newspapers as a practical matter. I give it some at the Manchester Union Leader in New Hampshire, which was very, very hard right Republican. They would go after people every day, putting their picture on the front page, getting pictures of them with their eyes closed or looking the wrong way. And so that's something you have to counter. But Steve is right. It's a problem. I think we may have somewhat different solutions to it, but it's definitely there.
We had a question in the back.
Hi, my name is Erwin Tantlin. My little connection with politics and elected legislators was I was the chairman of the State Food Association in 1977
sorry, the
called
state?
New York State Food Merchants.
Okay.
And part of what we did was try and keep the legislators informed about our problems and our issues, and it worked very well, and they were very good. And but my question is, something happened recently. There was a trial which everybody knows about called the Rittenhouse trial. And for the life of me, I can't understand why the President of the United States would get on the horn and castigate the jury for the decision they came to. It sort of upsets. And when we're looking for bipartisanship, and you guys, to my knowledge, and I was closer to it then because it was part of my job, but to my knowledge, it's not bipartisanship when you ferment dissatisfaction when it's really not your job. And I don't understand that mindset for a person that high or in that position.
Do you want to comment on that, Steve?
Yeah, look, I did not hear President Biden's comments, to be honest with you. I take your word for it. It is fair to say that he is not the first president in the past 5 years to castigate juries and judges for decisions with which he may have disagreed.
What are you talking about?
Wait.
No, it doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it right. And I think we'd all be better off if we got back to a more institutional, a greater respect for the different institutions and branches of government.
Do you
Yeah,
agree,
yeah,
Steve?
yeah, I do.
Peter?
I mean, I do believe in institutions. I think that it serves a purpose. I mean, apart from the actual legal purpose, I think it's important to have certain lines you don't go beyond. And the court systems, I would have had real differences with the Supreme Court back in the 70s and 80s, I guess. Certainly 70s, 60s and 70s. But it is the court, so you stop at a certain level. And you can say, if I'm elected president, I'll appoint different judges, but not to be castigating those. There's a line that in the past was not really crossed, but it is now.
Right, and just, again, to reflect on something, because we have highlighted, this is an important thing to highlight, the tacit agreement that both of you had that you would never, you would never work against the other in terms of an election, or the tacit agreement about not criticizing the courts. These are all, agreements that are not written in stone and written into law. And so much of our system and so much of bipartisanship seems to be built on custom and built on, just, okay, that's just not how it's done. We would call it in Hebrew derech eretz, just proper manners. And those aren't written anywhere. So you guys came up with that on your own, and you're saying, by and large, that's not observed.
And again, I think it's more typical of New York, that type. For instance, Chuck Schumer. He and I can have our differences, but we work together on a lot of issues. And now I'm making this personal. The day that I announced I wasn't running, Chuck Schumer put out a very nice statement. Congresswoman Omar from Minnesota actually started a petition drive against Chuck Schumer and said Peter King is a racist, he's a bigot.
Because
soon he gets out, and they said, good riddance, let him go and all that. And they went after Schumer. I mean, you shook the shot at me, but then they went on a nationwide effort against Chuck Schumer.
Just because of saying a gentleman's thank you.
I'm not making that personal. There's any number of other examples like that on both sides.
Right. Other questions? Yeah, there's a question in the back.
How do you guys see the redistricting process shaping out in New York? And how will it affect your respective parties, especially on Long Island?
So redistricting.
The question is how will the redistricting play out in New York and in particular Long Island?
New York's delegation will lose 1 seat in Congress. New York has ostensibly an independent bipartisan commission, but ultimately it will be the governor and the state legislature that will decide the lines. The last time we had redistricting, and Peter and I spent, I will confess, a great deal of time together trying to figure out where lines were drawn. And you know, I would say, I want every house with a mezuzah on it, Peter. You know, you're talking about sophistication, like we figured out.
I get all the Knights of Columbus.
You get the Knights of Columbus, I'll take the mezuzahs, right? That's called,
Maybe it'd be better
that's
if it was
called
reversed.
divine redistricting.
And we got great districts in the beginning.
And we got great districts in the beginning. And look, you know, we're kind of admitting, you know, that as dangerous as this process is, I would have had a more Democratic district and Peter would have had a more Republican district, and we would have been even more worried about attacks from the left and right. We were both consumers of the process, trying to figure out, how could the lines be drawn? What happened, I used 2010 to kind of explain what could happen in 2022, is the state legislature and the governor just decided they were not interested in drawing lines, and so it went to a court. And the courts drew lines which left our districts as fairly moderate. Right? So Peter's district was not a, when you want to look at performance, D+10 district, R+10 district. A D+10 district means that the typical Democrat is going to do 10 points better than a typical Republican. R+5 district, typical Republican will do about 5 points better than a typical Democrat. And our districts were both, yours was R3 to 5, was it? Or
more like 2 or 3, I think.
2 or 3, yeah. Right? And mine was D, 2 and 3, which meant that we had to reflect moderate positions and work with one another, because that's where our constituents were. So in the case where you had a truly independent process, a court drawing the lines based on math, not incumbent protection, you end up having districts that are fairly moderate, where compromise is valued, not vilified. In 2022, we lose a seat. The state legislature and the governor will come to an agreement. There is all sorts of, I'm sure you've heard the chatter already that Congressman Swazi's decided to leave the Congress to run for governor. And so there's already chatter that I've heard. I don't know how real it is that, well, maybe they'll just take that district out. That will be the one. And the Democrats actually believe if that happens, they could do quite well, because you can have more Democrats in the Zeldin district, more Democrats in the Garbarino district. You can put some more Republicans in Rice's district, but offset that by giving her more Democrats in Great Neck and Bayside, et cetera. So that's a possibility. They may go after Elise Stefanik in upstate New York, who was a very moderate Republican, who now has become one of President Trump's most ardent defenders. I suspect that it's going to be a very fluid process. The person who can really answer your question is actually in this audience. He's a member of the New York State Legislature. And he's going to not decide, but he will be, shall we say, at least informed about what the process is. So I brought 2 Sharpies for you to start drawing maps on your way out.
Well, I just say on that, for the most part, no offense to the state legislators, you don't see them for 10 years. And then when it comes time to reapportionment, they start holding fundraisers in Washington, knowing that everyone who wants a good district is going to contribute to their campaigns. And actually, there's a little bit more to the story, Steve. In 2012, the state Senate came up with a great district for me, and say something good district for you. Every district in the state was agreed upon except Charlie Rangel's. And they knew Charlie Rangel was going to retire, and in very New York ethnic terms, it became a fight among the Dominicans, the Puerto Ricans, the African Americans, and Shirley Silver, who was the Orthodox Jew, was not going to get involved in that fight. Unless every district is agreed on, the whole state goes to court. So because of Rangel's district, that's how we ended up
in court.
And I remember we were on the phone and said, how did this happen to us?
Yeah, all of a sudden,
but it was a whole different world.
all of a sudden I was representing Whitestone, Queens. I'd represented East Islip, and now I was in Whitestone, Queens one morning.
And I had a district which was 2% minority, went from 2% minority to 35% minority. And I got places like Wyandanch were 97% African American, and Central Islip and others. And on the other hand, I had all these Jewish voters in Jericho and Old Bethpage and Long Beach. I lost all of them. Wow. So, which meant I didn't have as many of the Sunday morning breakfast campaign.
We have another question.
Gentlemen, very fascinating. Thank you all. Thank you for coming very much tonight. I've always been on the fence, really neither one way or another, on term limits. I'd like your opinion on term limits at some level. I understand longevity is important, and there's always a learning curve when you first get to Congress. What's your opinion on term limits?
I'm against them.
I'm against them also.
Yeah, I think it goes against democracy. It's basically saying you can't vote for the person you want to. And if a person's not doing a job, it's not always, there's benefits to being an incumbent. There's also real problems because you have a record and you've had to vote on issues which maybe in January of the first year you're in, it was popular. By the time it comes around to election day, it's unpopular. Or you've alienated certain special interests, or you really hit a raw nerve. To me, it's taken away from people the right. And I think one thing I'll say, among others, that in the Israeli system, they can be there forever. And to me, you need that type of. If you have people coming in every 6 years or 8 years or whatever, there's no institutional memory. And so if you think it's partisan now, it really would be partisan, I think, if you have people coming in for.
You think term limits would have the opposite effect? In other words,
it would. That's my opinion.
And it would also empower K Street and lobbyists. Because if they know that you're only there for 3 terms, 6 years, they'll wait you out. They're there for 40 years. They'll wait you out. They'll wait for some new freshman to come in that they can figure out how to manipulate or create contribute PACs to. It is very empowering to the lobbyist community to tell a member of Congress represented, elected by his or her district, that no matter what, they're out. My favorite story about term limits was after I announced that I was leaving. Well, actually, this is a couple years ago. This woman comes up to me and she said, "Oh, Mr. Israel, I'm so sorry you've gone. You were so wonderful. I wish you were back. I had one disagreement with you." I said, "What was that?" She said, "Term limits." You figure that one out.
we have time for one more question. Go ahead.
Hi, guys. Thank you for coming tonight. My question would be, congressmen, senators, they're all powerful, smart men.
Women, yeah.
But they each, in my opinion, wield big egos. And maybe that's big ego is what's helped them get into office. But I wonder, where does ego play in the role of bipartisanship? And what laws, have been, I don't want to say been passed in legislation passed almost for sport and spite because of a particular senator's ego, and essentially he's saying, I want this bill, I'm going to get this bill. It might not be the best bill for my constituency, but I'm being pressured either politically and so on, and I'm going to ram it down the other party's throat. And it's really ego-driven and not necessarily in either his district's best interest or the country's best interests.
I would say that's human nature, unfortunately, so many people. But if you do have 435 members, hopefully you can sort that out. You can find ways to end that. But that's part of the human interaction. And so I think that's why, with all its faults, Congress works. I mean, it can work better than it is now. But I don't know what the alternative is. I mean, it's up to the American people and members of Congress to make it better. But the system, there are. I can name a bunch of egomaniacs on both sides. But for the most part, they get stopped somewhere along the line.
Yeah. I would say, look, bad news and better news. The bad news is, in my view, too many people are running for Congress and getting elected not because they want to legislate, but because they want to be famous. They're not because of the number of bills they want to pass, but the number of followers that they want to have on Twitter and Facebook. And that's on both sides of the aisle, both sides of the aisle. Here's the better news. There's a marvelous book that Robert Kaplan wrote called Warrior Politics. It was required reading in my office. And he talks about the real brilliance of our founders were that they were constructive pessimists. They understood human nature. They knew that there's going to be a clash of egos and a certain level of absolutism in governing. And so they built a system to withstand the egos. They built a system where you would have 3 branches of government countering one another. That you would have a House countering the Senate and the Senate countering the House. That you'd have senators whose egos could be dissipated over 6 years, and then members of Congress whose egos were probably never satisfied, and they had to just get stuff done within a 2-year period. And so that fundamental understanding of ego and human nature created a system based on constructive pessimism. We are human beings. We're going to make mistakes. We have to build a system that embraces human nature and enables us to govern. That's worked very well for us. With all the nonsense that's going on, it's worked very well for us. I think it is stressed more now than it has been since the 1920s and arguably since the 1850s. But if we can find dialogues like this and forums like this and convey a sense of hope that members from both sides of the aisle can come to an agreement, I think that becomes a model that the American people have a very healthy appetite to see replicated.
Yeah, the real separation of powers, which is really almost a conflict of powers, which I think is good.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, like people say, how come it takes so long to get a certain bill through? Well, that's built into the system. Because you can have something, some tragic event happen somewhere, and you could ram through legislation almost unanimously the next day, and then you realize a month from then how bad it really was, or the defects that are in there. So it has to go through slow. You have the committee process. Now, it can be abused, but then it goes to the House, and it goes to the Senate. They make changes, it comes back to us. But there is, in the long run, that makes it work. And then, if we do screw up, the president can veto it, or he can screw it up, but veto, and then you have the Supreme Court. So you have all this, I mean, often, you know, we've seen debates where they say, well, we want to do this, but the court wouldn't allow it.
Yeah.
So you're trying to frame it in a way that keeps the Supreme Court out of it. And that's all part of the system to make it work.
Look, I want to thank. No.
The presidency in term limits, and without Bloomberg getting a third term with a term limit.
We're going to conclude the program now. So I want to just thank both of you for.
You'd be a good speaker of the House.
Yeah, that's right. Bring that gavel down.
So I want to thank both Representative King and Representative Israel.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I just want to highlight for everyone, first of all, it's been my pleasure to sit here with both of you and to listen from both of you and to learn from you, but that you model friendship and while also maintaining disagreement, I think is really important for people to see and for people to emulate. The ideas that you both put forth, to listen to opinions that you disagree with, I think we really need to do more of that. So thank you. Thank you.
It was easier for me because I knew that when we disagreed that I was always right. So I had that.
So thank you
And
for
I tolerated his stubbornness.
Good job. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you.
Everyone.